On the edge of a distant human colony, where junkyards stretched wider than cities and forgotten tech piled up like rusting mountains, there moved a man named Tom who had long since given up on grand dreams. Now he lived quietly dealing in scraps, trading worn-out machines and broken relics for a few credits here. And there his life was ordinary, steady, and full of quiet until the day he wandered into a low-level space salvage auction. Not far from the old freight lanes, the auction was small, filled with leftover storage containers and broken starship parts. Nothing ever valuable showed up there, but Tom liked to visit now and then, hoping to stumble upon a piece worth repairing, or at least something interesting enough to break the dull routine that day. The heat hung thick, the bidders were few, and the items even fewer. Tom sipped stale coffee and glanced around lazily until his eyes fell on a large container placed in the far corner of the lot. It was old beyond measure, dented, scorched on one side, and sealed shut with rusted locking bolts. Unlike the others, this one had no label, no origin code, no tag, and no one seemed to be paying attention to it. The auctioneer waved a hand toward it, calling it a mystery unit from a cargo sweep, and started the bid at 1 credit. Most of the crowd laughed, shrugged, and moved on, but something about the container pulled at Tom. Curiosity had always been his weakness, and he couldn't look away, so he raised his hand and offered 1 single credit. The auctioneer smirked, called it sold, and moved on. An hour later, Tom was towing the massive storage unit back to his scrapyard. With the help of his loader drone, he placed it in the middle of his workspace, cleared off the debris, and stood before it, unsure what exactly he had bought. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, maybe longer. The markings were faded, the metal warm with sun and time, and the lock mechanism was unfamiliar to him. He knelt beside the control panel, brushed off layers of dust, and hooked in his old decryptor tool. Sparks flew briefly, then the seal lights blinked one by one, and the door creaked open, releasing a faint hiss of stale air and something else. Something cold and sterile and strangely sweet inside. He saw rows of upright pods built into the walls of the container, each one covered in a cloudy glass. Layer cables ran between them, glowing faintly like veins, and in the dim light he saw silhouettes within the pods, slender, unmoving figures with long limbs and soft outlines. Not machines, not tools, not cargo. They were people, or something like it. He stepped closer, heart pounding, and wiped the glass of the nearest pod clean. Behind it lay a girl, her skin pale, her eyes closed, her hair flowing like silk in zero gravity. She looked peaceful, asleep, untouched by time, and beside her were more just like her, dozens, maybe more, each sealed in silence. Tom backed away, stunned thoughts racing through his mind. Had he just bought a grave? Had he stumbled on a lost crew? Maybe prisoners or medical patients. But no, these weren't ordinary colonists. The technology in the pods was beyond anything he had seen, and etched on the metal near the base of each capsule were strange symbols, a language he didn't recognize. He pulled out his scanner, but it blinked red. No data found, no match in known records. It was as if the unit came from nowhere, or from some age long buried beneath the stars. Suddenly the lights inside the container flickered. The pods began to hum low and slow, as if reacting to his presence. He reached toward one, hesitated, then pressed his hand against the activation panel. A soft glow emerged, the symbols pulsed, and for a moment everything was still. Then a single pod emitted a soft chime, and a new light flickered near the top. It wasn't just a storage unit, it was a vault filled with life. Still sleeping, still hidden, waiting for something or someone. Tom took a step back, his heart still racing. The sun outside had begun to dip, but inside that container something had awakened, and he knew his quiet, simple life had just ended forever. Sky outside turned orange as the sun began to set across the dusty yard, but Tom didn't move from his place near the strange container. His eyes remained fixed on the softly glowing pod where the unknown girl lay, still as stone, surrounded by humming lights and faint pulses of energy. His breath felt shallow, as if the air around him had grown thinner. He had seen many things in his life: broken ships drifting in space, forgotten tech floating across orbit, old war machines rusting under moonlight, But never something like this, not a container full of silent life forms, not a chamber that felt more like a secret than a piece of junk. Tom ran his hand through his hair and tried to think. Straight, the girl inside looked human, or almost human, with soft features and calm expression, her eyes closed as if dreaming, her body untouched by age or injury, preserved perfectly by the unknown technology that kept her asleep. The other pods beside her held similar figures, each with slight differences in face and posture, but all sharing the same sense of quiet purpose. They didn't look like refugees or sick patients. They looked like soldiers wrapped in stillness, waiting for something long overdue. He stepped back and opened his cum device. His fingers hesitated for a second, then tapped the name of an old friend. Ben, a quiet tech specialist who had once worked in deep systems and now spent his days restoring satellites and decoding ancient logs. Ben answered after a few moments, his voice crackling slightly through static. Tom told him everything about the auction, the pod, the figures inside the lights, the symbols, and the strange activation. Ben didn't laugh, didn't joke, didn't ask if Tom had been drinking. Instead, he simply said he'd be there in an hour. By the time Ben arrived, night had fallen, and the scrapyard sat in silence, broken only by the low hum coming from the open container. Tom led him inside and showed him the pod first, then the others, then the strange symbols carved near each one. Ben's eyes widened and he pulled out a small scanner. The device flickered, glitched, and then rebooted, unable to identify most of the materials used in the pod structure or the exact origin of the language. Whatever this was, it wasn't from any known faction or empire, not human, not from the three major trade species, not even pirate black tech. It was something else, something older. Ben walked slowly among the rows of sleeping girls, tapping on the glass with the back of his fingers, studying the layout, the wiring, the position of the control panel. He paused near the pod that had begun reacting earlier and focused on a specific glowing sequence in the corner of the panel. He squinted, tapped a few commands on his portable pad, and slowly the strange letters began shifting, forming recognizable characters and partial translations. The words were broken, but certain phrases became clear enough. One of them read Stasis, Unit Level 5, another read Guardian Protocol Active, and then there was one phrase that repeated more than once in different places, translated loosely as property of the First Empire. Tom and Ben exchanged glances. Neither of them had heard of such an empire in any history or database, and yet the container was real, the girls inside were real, and something about them felt deliberate, as if their discovery had triggered a system long forgotten, perhaps even a warning. Then, without a sound, one of the pods began to shift. The front panel dimmed, and the locks clicked open. Steam flowed out, and a low tone echoed through the container. Tom stepped forward instinctively while Ben raised his scanner and adjusted the feed. The pod's glass lifted, slowly revealing the girl inside. Her fingers twitched, her chest rose in slow, shallow breaths, and then her eyes opened, deep violet eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Her gaze moved slowly around the container and stopped at Tom. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She tried to rise, but her limbs were stiff from long sleep. She collapsed slightly, and Tom moved forward, helping her gently. She flinched at his touch, but did not resist. Her skin felt cold, smooth, unfamiliar, not like a human exactly, but close. She looked around at the other pods, then back at him. Her voice finally came. Though it was quiet and broken, she spoke a word he didn't understand, then another, then finally in a voice shaped by a language long lost. She asked, "Where is the war?" Tom didn't know how to answer, and neither did Ben. The girl looked tired, confused, alert, and ready all at once, like someone pulled from a dream they couldn't understand. She tried to step forward, but staggered and leaned against the side of her pod. The lights above her flickered slightly, and more of the other pods began to pulse softly. One by one, a new rhythm moved through the container, as if something deep inside the system had sensed that it was time to wake the rest. Ben stepped back and whispered that they might have activated a sequence, and that if it wasn't stopped, more would awaken, whether they were ready or not. Tom looked around at the faces behind the glass, each one resting in a perfect dream, untouched by time, and now threatened by whatever protocol had been reawakened by his presence. He didn't know who these girls were or what they were meant for, but one thing he did know was that they were not meant to be left forgotten any longer. Silence inside the container had changed. It was no longer the quiet of abandonment, but the stillness. Before something unknown began to stir, Tom stood beside the girl who had awakened her, breathing steady. Now her violet eyes filled with something more than confusion. They carried weight, as if they had seen things no longer remembered in this part of space. Her name was Lyra. That much he managed to understand as hours passed and broken. Fragments of speech turned into meaning with the help of translation tools, patched code, and patience. She moved slowly, but her mind worked quickly, observing everything around her, understanding more than she could explain. Her hands moved over the pods, her fingers hovering above faded symbols and cracked panels. Her face showed no panic, no fear, only focus as she touched one unit, then another, whispering words in a language that seemed like music mixed with memory. She explained in halting phrases that she and the others were guardians, protectors, bred not from families, but from ancient science, not born to live ordinary lives, but to serve in times of crisis, defenders of an empire that no longer existed. The first empire, as she called it, had once ruled the stars. Far before human colonies had reached the outer rings, it had fallen. Not in war, but in silence, its cities abandoned, its people vanished, and as part of its final act, it created the Guardian Line, a fleet of bioengineered soldiers placed in hidden locations scattered through the void, waiting for commands that never came. Lyra and the others had been asleep for what felt like centuries, stored in this container, jettisoned to protect them during the last days when everything fell apart. Tom listened without interrupting, then recorded every word, every symbol, scanning the pods that still held the sleeping girls, each one preserved in a stasis far beyond modern human technology, their vitals stable, their systems humming softly like heartbeats wrapped in metal. The more they learned, the clearer it became that these were not ordinary beings. They were made with precision, trained through mind-linked memory, and virtual trials, prepared for wars that never reached them. Then Lyra told them something else, something that changed everything. She said the container had protocols linked to an emergency signal, a distress beacon, meant only to activate if the container was found by enemies or tampered with in certain ways. And now that it had been opened, now that one of them had awakened, the signal had gone out into space, silent, invisible, but fast as light. Tom felt his chest tighten as she spoke of possible threats: pirates, scavengers, slavers, factions that hunted for forgotten tech or ancient biology, anything that could be sold or weaponized. Ben checked the sensors again and found something that confirmed her words. A faint pulse had indeed been emitted hours ago. It was weak, but clear enough to be picked up by anyone within range. And this part of space was not empty for long. Tom looked at the container, then at Lyra, and finally at the stars above, knowing that whatever came next would not be simple. Despite everything, Lyra showed no fear, her posture straight, her eyes calm. She told them that even if they were not fully awakened, even if their memories were broken and their strength not yet returned, they would fight. If needed, they were not trained to hide. They were trained to protect, especially the one who had awakened them. Tom didn't know what to say to that. He had never thought of himself as important as someone worth guarding. But Lyra seemed certain the others would feel the same once they woke. The hum within the container had changed again. More pods were showing signs of activation, their lights growing brighter, their locks releasing pressure, slowly awakening like seeds in sunlight. The energy readings rose steadily, and Ben warned that soon a full reboot might occur, that the entire group could come out of stasis at once, and that they didn't have the resources to handle it alone. But Tom knew they didn't have a choice. If danger was coming, and the girls were waking, then it was better they wake here, with someone who didn't mean them harm outside. The wind moved through the scrapyard, quiet and unnoticed. But the skies above it were not as calm. Satellites picked up movement near the system edge, faint traces of a ship slipping past long-range scans. A vessel without a known tag approaching silently, without response codes, without warning. Tom watched the readings come in and felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. The dollar He had spent at the auction now felt like the most expensive decision of his life, not because of what he found, but because of what it might cost him to protect. It and still the girls slept, unaware of the world waiting for them beyond the container walls, unaware of the questions rising in human minds and unaware of the ship drawing closer each second, silent as a knife in the dark. The stars above the scrapyard gleamed like scattered silver dust, and though the land below slept in silence, the darkness in orbit had begun to shift. Something was coming, something drawn, not by accident, but by the signal that had escaped the ancient container. Tom stood near the entrance of the storage unit, eyes on the data screen, showing a vessel approaching with no known signature, no call sign, and no clearance. It flew without light, without sound, and without delay, moving like a hunter that had already chosen its prey. Ben sat near the console, trying to patch a temporary defense field around the scrapyard, but he knew it wouldn't be enough against anything serious inside the container. More of the girls had begun to stir. The humming grew louder with every minute, the pods unlocking one after another as the deep systems reacted to the long-awaited command. The light in the unit had changed to a soft gold like the first sun after winter, and the air carried a quiet electricity. Lyra now stood fully upright, moving with more balance, her mind clearer than before, her speech still broken, but filled with purpose. She walked between the others, waking them gently, whispering names or codes known only to her, and one by one the sleeping guardians opened their eyes. Each girl looked around, not with fear, but with calm, as if this strange new world was only another battlefield waiting to be understood. They listened to Lyra, closely followed her gestures, examined Tom and Ben with long, focused glances, and without panic accepted the reality before them. They did not ask who had found them. They asked what needed to be done. Tom tried to explain the threat, but words were not needed. Lyra placed her hand against a side panel, and within seconds, old container began to transform. Systems once asleep surged to life. Compartments opened and revealed hidden armor pieces, slim weapons, energy fields, shaped by ancient design, not built for war, but for precision. Ben stared in disbelief as one of the girls adjusted a wristband that unfolded into a glowing blade, not sharp with metal, but with controlled plasma, the kind used in old Empire tech that had not been seen for generations. They weren't just guardians by title, they were trained soldiers, and though time had taken much, their instinct remained whole. They began to prepare themselves for what was coming, each one moving with purpose, choosing gear that matched their build, as if every motion had been memorized long ago. Tom tried to stop them, tried to ask if they were strong enough to face what might be out there, but Lyra shook her head and placed a hand on his shoulder. She said softly that he had awakened them, and because of that they were now bound by code, not by force, but by choice and design to protect him and this place from harm. Their training was incomplete, their memories fractured, but one thing remained certain: they would not let harm reach the one who had shown them kindness. Outside, the scanners blinked. Red, the ship had entered low orbit, moving into position above the yard, its silhouette large and jagged like something stitched together from wreckage. It didn't respond to hails, and it didn't slow down. It descended quickly and landed with a harsh wave of dust and wind from its side ramp. Stepped figures in armor, black and patched, their faces hidden, their weapons raised. They were mercenaries hired, guns looking for salvage or something better to sell. Their leader shouted out into the yard, claiming salvage rights, demanding all cargo, including the container, be surrendered at once or the yard would burn. Tom stood frozen for a moment, then looked toward the container just as Lyra and the first wave of awakened girls stepped forward. They walked in calm lines, their armor gleaming faintly in the moonlight, their eyes steady and focused, and without waiting for permission, they moved into position, surrounding the yard like a silent shield. Ben activated the weak defense grid and hoped it would buy them a few seconds at most. The mercenaries laughed at first, seeing young girls dressed in unfamiliar armor standing without cover. They raised their rifles and stepped forward, thinking this would be easy, but they didn't know what the girls truly were, didn't know their design, their speed, their instincts. And when the first bolt fired, the air shifted. One of the girls caught it mid-air with a flash of her wristband redirecting it into the ground before the enemy could blink. Another girl launched forward faster than any human could track, striking with a palm that sent 2 soldiers sprawling before they hit the ground. Chaos erupted. Gunfire lit the dark, but the Guardians did not falter. They moved with silent precision, working together without needing words, defending not to kill, but to disable, to disarm, to send a message. They weren't just relics, and they weren't helpless. Within minutes, the mercenaries were overwhelmed, their weapons destroyed, their leader pinned beneath a broken wing of his own ship, and the rest fleeing into the shadows. They had come looking for treasure, and found something they couldn't understand. Lyra stood over the leader and spoke in his own language, words she had picked up from Tom and Ben, her voice calm and final. She told him to leave and never return, or next time they would not be so gentle. He stared at her, confused and afraid, before running back to his ship and vanishing into the night sky like a rat escaping fire. Tom watched all of it with wide eyes, unsure what surprised him more, the attack or the defense, or the way the girls moved, like they had always known this moment would come. Lyra returned to him and simply said it had begun, and now the others would be coming, those who heard the signal, those who wanted power from the past. And now the Guardians must decide what they would do with their second life, with their freedom, and with the one who had given them both. The sun returned slowly as morning light spilled across the scrapyard, now covered in pieces of broken armor, scorched earth, and cracked metal. The scent of heat and plasma still lingered in the air, but the quiet had returned, not as it was before, but in a new way, the kind of silence that follows a storm, when everything broken finally settles and something new waits to grow from the dust. Tom stood near the edge of the container, his eyes scanning the ground where the mercenaries had tried to take what did not belong to them. They were gone, now driven off not by weapons of war, but by precision and will, by girls who were never meant to be victims, who had found the reason to rise again. The other girls continued waking slowly, one after another, their pods releasing soft hissing sounds as warm air and ancient systems gave them breath. After centuries of waiting, they opened their eyes to a world they did not understand, to faces they did not know, to a sky that had moved on without them. And yet none of them cried, none of them panicked. They stepped forward and listened. They observed. They followed Lyra, who had become their voice, not because she was chosen, but because she had awakened. First, because she had looked into the eyes of a human and seen not a threat, but something worth trusting. Tom gathered them near the fire pit, where he had once burned old crates and scrap, now cleaned and turned into a place where stories could be shared. He offered food, not knowing if they would accept it. He offered water and space and his home, not because he had to, but because it felt right to him, because they had defended what was his without asking for anything in return. The girls took what they needed and nothing more. Some smiled softly, others sat quietly and watched the wind move through the wires and metal, as if it too was trying to understand who they were now. Ben finished setting up the last of the signal blockers far above the yard to keep any further signals from escaping. They could not risk another uninvited guest, not yet, not until they knew what to do with the past that had come back from sleep. He spoke to Tom about hiding the container, deeper about moving it, maybe burying the pods again, but Tom shook his head. He didn't want to turn them into secrets again. They had spent too long in silence, and now they deserved more than the dark later. As the sun climbed higher, Tom walked with Lyra through the yard, showing her old machines, faded memories, and forgotten tools he had once thought valuable. She listened, quietly asked simple questions, and stopped often to touch things, as if feeling the weight of time through rust and wire. She told him that their minds were not whole. Many memories were gone, fragments, floating inside, waiting for connection. But their purpose was not forgotten. They had been made to guard something, to protect, not to destroy. And now, without an empire or command, they had to decide what protection meant. Tom looked at her and asked why she had chosen to defend him, why she had led the others into battle when she could have run or waited or hidden. She paused, then said it was not because he had power or answers. It was because he had seen them not as tools, not as weapons, but as people. He had not tried to control them, or sell them, or use them, and in that moment of choice they had found purpose again. In choosing to protect someone who gave them nothing but freedom, others began building with materials from the yard, shaping small shelters, repairing the old workshop. Cleaning broken systems that had been dead for years, they moved with quiet energy, rebuilding not for survival, but for belonging. They were no longer soldiers of an empire. They were something else, something new, and Tom watched them work with a strange feeling in his chest, a mix of pride, confusion, and quiet fear, because deep down he knew more would come, more ships, more questions, more threats. The galaxy did not forget things like this. He also knew that he would not face them alone, not anymore, because the girls had chosen him, and he had chosen them not with contracts or orders, but with small acts, with trust and kindness and shared silence under strange stars. And now the scrapyard was no longer just a place of rust. It had become something more. It had become a home, and so the story did not end with a fight or a farewell, but with the beginning of something rare, the birth of a bond that had no name between a man who had spent $1 on a mystery and an army of forgotten girls who had decided to be forgotten no longer. Together, they would shape a new path, not as soldiers, not as relics, but as protectors of something more fragile than war, something stronger than machines. The fragile, simple future that begins when someone chooses to care. The end.